It's awesome, man. Amazing to see a lot of new faces and old faces. Fantastic to have you. So today, Brandon, Brandon Zhang is joining us, a member of the Visualize Value team and a man of many talents, building his own little media empire. So, Brandon, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Jack.
Awesome. You are. I appreciate you doing this. So, we are here to talk specifically about your podcast, Student Mindset, and I just think there's a great many lessons to be learned. One from, how long you've been doing it and the tactical things you've learned over the last few months or so, but also, starting from scratch, as it were. So, Brandon, you're 19 years old, correct?
Yeah.
Student and no formal experience to speak of, which I think in a lot of cases, myself included, would have prevented me from traveling the path you've traveled. So I think you're a great example and you can share a lot of insight on how to get started from scratch. So 5 months ago, you said you started this. What was your reason for getting into it?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at kind of the first couple of guests I had on, I was like looking at a lot of stuff on the internet and it was very much like people saying, right? Like if you want to grow, like make your own little place on the internet, you have to niche down. And so for me, that was my initial attempt, right? Like I felt like I just graduated high school, like what would be something that people like me would want to listen to? And initially I just like identified too closely with this surface level idea of like what being a student means. So I basically just talked with a bunch of college students that I thought were doing cool things, that were creating things. A lot of them had YouTube channels. A lot of them were just like building their own kind of audiences as well. And so I think I learned a lot from that in terms of like niching down right away isn't always the right choice. Like you said, I like didn't have that much like formal experience or an idea of like what I was actually aiming to do, right? And although like you can like leverage a lot of things within those communities, within those niches, like making your building your name and brand in those areas, like if you're not really enjoying like the process, it's harder to do. So for me, talking with these people, I felt like after 5 episodes, it was kind of like I was hearing the same thing over and over again, and
Hmm.
it might have been my fault in terms of like not diversifying the guests enough or like not looking at the right places. But I also just felt like talking to other students, it was I don't blame them at all, but it was just like I think like for students a lot of times like we all grew up in the same generation. We all kind of grew up with the same inputs, similar backgrounds. It was just like I felt like I was just talking to like me, and
Right,
I
right.
wanted people that weren't so similar to myself. And so that was kind of also I think it was just like by measure of luck in terms of it was kind of like when I was kind of getting more into Twitter and like a lot of these people I found on Twitter. And I think that like almost like if someone asked me to describe like what my niche is or something like that now, I would just say like it's people that I look up to on Twitter and it's almost like the defining I guess like the common denominator is that like it's what people who follow me, who follow you, who are just like follow these type of people on Twitter, like are what like things that they would be interested in.
Hmm.
I think that it's not necessarily a umbrella topic. It's just like this general like curiosity for this type of content.
So, yes, great point. So the vehicle of a podcast originally, did you have a an objective in mind when you started this? And if so, has that objective changed over time?
Yeah, definitely when I think for a lot of people, right? I've talked to a lot of people about doing this podcast thing just like by virtue of like hosting people that also have their own podcasts on the show, like talking to with them a bit before and after. Like and one kind of conclusion that a lot of people don't that a lot of podcasters don't like to share is that it's pretty inherently like selfish. Like you control all the questions you're asking, you control like which guests you're bringing on. It's really like for me, it was a lot. It was like a journey of self-discovery almost, right? Like it was like my senior, I guess like my senior year, like I didn't have graduation, didn't get to travel like I was originally planning on. I was like, what can I do to like kind of like find myself in this world where I'm like kind of stuck at home, but I also want to branch out, right? Because I have that feeling of I want to branch out and meet more people. And so like really at first it was just kind of like basically I think Jeff Morris Jr. Who he just tweeted this recently, but it's like podcasting is basically like become the new like can I pick your brain on something? It's just like a
Right.
nicer way to package it almost. And
Right. Right.
so yeah, I basically tried to get on that and really talk to people that I looked up to. And I mean, I talked with Pomp a bit about this. I think this was actually in the episode where he kind of talks about like for him as well, even like his own podcast is really just a selfish practice, and like the least he can do is share it to his audience in terms of like he feels like it's a little sad that like it's only him that gets to determine the questions. And that's why like I picked up on the practice from him where it's like before I do an episode with someone, I'll usually try and post it on Twitter. Oh, I'm like interviewing this person, like do you have questions to ask? Because I feel like as one person you really are kind of limited in how much research you can do, like what
Hmm.
perspective you're looking at things from. So I think that's why I started really. It was just kind of a selfish
Yeah,
way
no,
to try.
that's a good answer. A great frame for it too. I think more often than not, if you approach something from a selfish perspective for yourself, there is going to be something to be gleaned for someone who's in your situation or a similar situation. So it makes sense as a frame for how you would run these conversations. Can you talk a little bit about the process of getting started and how things have changed with how many episodes are you at now?
I did, I think, 18 for season one, and I think I'm sitting at 14 on season two.
Okay.
So 32, I think I've done now. For a little bit, I did once a week. Recently, I've been doing two a week because it's just, I think like it kind of gets at this, but like when I started, I was like so caught up in the editing. I was so caught up in trying to make it sound really perfect that basically, if you listen to my first couple of episodes, they sound really robotic. There's no ums, there's no kind of silences at all. It flows really smoothly, right? If you're kind of like if you view it like you view music, it flows really
Right.
smoothly. But the listening experience is definitely better when you worry about a bit less. Only cut if there's like weird, like if someone makes a mistake or your guest feels uncomfortable, like with something they said, like maybe they revealed something that hasn't dropped yet or something like that.
Sure.
Like pretty much those are the only cuts I make now, and it's just like one of the lessons that kind of this quote reflects. I think I've learned a lot just by starting, right? Like the great thing about podcasting is like no one's really going to listen to your first couple of episodes, so it's fully okay to just experiment. um, I've experimented with putting like some short quotes at the start of my podcast, almost as like a trailer. That's worked out pretty well. I've also experimented with the show notes, really trying to like look at what other people are doing. But you're only able to apply what like these other people you're looking at are doing if you have like a good, consistent schedule yourself. I know like a lot of people that reach out to me and are saying like, oh, I'm thinking about starting like I have like these episodes ready, but I don't know what to do. Like I'm getting cold feet or something like that. Like my main advice is just to um, like you can set up like you can accumulate all these episodes, but I think the most important thing is getting into like a pattern, right? James Clear and habits, like things like that. Like the entire production process should be a habit, like writing the
Hmm.
questions. There's like a lot of moving parts. So once you just get really familiar with it, it becomes really comfortable.
Awesome, man. And then obviously Twitter has played a huge part in both promoting the podcast and building the connections to invite people onto the podcast. So we have a little section here about how you've used Twitter as a complementary platform for the podcast. You want to talk a little bit about what kind of state your Twitter was in when you began this, and how the podcasting exercise has grown that, and how the two play off each other.
Yeah, I would definitely say like the podcast has been kind of like I would say what is the superpower behind kind of like what's happened with my growth on Twitter. I think it's just like the growth has been more of a byproduct of some of the conversations that the podcast has had. I think like the podcast has just given me a reason to reach out to people, right? I feel like a lot of people, the biggest thing, this is kind of like more of a Twitter lesson, but I think the biggest thing is people think that a lot of people's DMs are kind of a little crowded, or like you shouldn't do it because you don't have a great connection or pitch or something. But like really when you looked at when I started on Twitter, I had maybe like 300 followers. I was still posting like I was still doing the thing where I just like post links from my blog without any like sort of a
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
preface or and just hope I'd get a couple likes or anything like that. But like when I started like reaching out to people, like they would tell me things to do. They would point me in the direction of other people, and it's just like having a reason to DM someone and really nailing like a small value proposition, like you're giving something in return, can like really accelerate it. Because once you build a couple connections, like that's kind of all you need to use Twitter.
All right, so let's talk about a specific example here where Pomp, I imagine most of the people on this call have seen this guy, if not fairly large Twitter account, crouching up on 400,000 followers. So, guy's got a big platform, and at the time you reach out to this guy, you have a significantly smaller audience. He runs a big podcast. How do you think about this, and how do you reach out and get guests to, ultimately accept your invitation?
Yeah, initially like this, I wasn't even thinking of I wasn't when I originally did this article, like I saw a webinar that prompted with David Perel. Thought that was really interesting. A couple of like lessons that I really applied to my audience building kind of ideas, just like kind of like naturally flowed and it really resonated with me. So I wrote an article about it. At that time, I was writing on Medium a lot, just like during the summer or something to do. And I kind of just like summarized it, put my own spin on it, and reached out to him just saying like I published this, and he was really
Awesome.
responsive afterwards. Like I honestly did not expect to ask him to come on the podcast after immediately, but then I realized like this is probably like a good chance that I was gonna have. It also resonates with like a point I have later, which is like kind of just strike the iron when hot, which is like the point after this. Actually, the order's a little.
Oh, no worries.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I was planning to use the James Clear example here, but it also works for Pomp. Like I sent that article and realized like this was probably one of the moments where he's like, oh, this is a good article. It's like a good connection. It's fully based off the idea of like permissionless apprentice that I got from Jack. Just like not asking him for the permission to do it. Like it's quite a small thing. It's really just helping him spread some of his ideas on. But for to someone like that, it's a lot more powerful than just saying, "Hey man, really like your content,"
Right.
like a cold email open, right, or cold DM open. It's something a little different. I think a lot more on Twitter now. I feel like a lot of people are building Notion templates for someone, building websites for someone. I think it's just like, yeah, like that's the one thing. Like if you want like it's like 100% basically reply rate. If you
Make something for someone. Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, the second lesson here from Pomp is that obviously he's a busy guy, right? Kind of on the podcast talking to him, his days are basically booked from like 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. with just 1 hour calls, 1 hour blocks. He was super efficient, but like as you can see here, I wasn't getting a response. He like at this point he agreed to do the podcast already, so like I wouldn't recommend like spamming someone if they haven't agreed. Like Pomp has agreed at this point. We're just kind of working out the details. And so,
Right.
but like a lot of people get discouraged after not getting a response like right away or not getting your first response. Like I've talked with a lot of people, like following up is not often like if you follow up just once, it's not viewed as spam. It just views as like you actually do care, and you do want to get it done. So I think just getting rid of the idea that following up shows that you're desperate or anything like that. Like that's just such a negative view. Like in all honesty, like a lot of people that you're going to reach out to, like they're going to have a lot of their pipeline is going to be very full. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, I think one thing I would point out here as well is the level of detail that goes into your pitch for the podcast itself as well. So the fact that you've done your homework on Pomp and you've consumed his content is not only obvious based on the fact you've written an article about him and you've made something based off of some content of his that you consumed, but the additional layer of, hey, can you come on my podcast because I want to ask you XYZ and I'm interested on your perspective in this, and this. Just personally speaking, messages like that are going to cut through the noise of, hey, Pomp, want to be on my podcast?
Yeah, because I think like it's just like it's just that like people really care about like the level you go to. I think once you get to that point, like I'm sure people like you and Pomp, like you get like probably 10 messages a day, which are just like really basic in a way, kind of like with similar asks, but it just makes the one or two um, good outreaches like so much more special. I don't know if you guys seen like I thought the post Austin Reef posted about like that one um,
Yeah,
like
yeah, I see that.
job pitch, like that was really really well done. But I just think like yeah, if you're impressing someone to that level, like there's gonna be kind of a follow up there, no matter like how busy they are.
Yeah, I would say the bar is low, honestly.
Yeah,
Bosley has a huge audience, but in general, yeah, the amount of there's like a bit of an arbitrage opportunity for you, right? If you put the work in and then reach out, like there's really no downside for you, and you create a traffic to your site off of this asset here, regardless of whether or not he reaches back out to you. So it's not like you spent all of this time creating something that is never going to see the light of day. I think that slight reframe can really help people, not feel like they're wasting time writing cold outreach, but you're building this library of assets regardless of whether or not you get in touch with this person. But chances are it won't be difficult to get in touch with that person because all of your competition is sending the lazy message saying, hey, can you be my first podcast guest? One great
yeah,
thing I heard from, Seth Godin has a little podcast, like school or product where he teaches people how to build a podcast. He gets asked, hey, Seth, will you come on my podcast? He goes, yeah, I'll come on your 100th episode, which I think is a
yeah,
great way to frame it up for his students. It's like, yeah, I'll be on your podcast, but I'm not going to be your first guest, so you're not going to like leverage my platform for the third episode and then never record another podcast. I want to make sure that you get into the rhythm of it before I make that commitment. So I think I think this is a great example of that. And the work that you do to get this opportunity is not wasted if the opportunity doesn't arrive in the way or the shape that you think it's going to arrive. All right, so you got a little bit in here about the conversation itself.
yeah. I think I kind of talked a bit about it earlier, like not being too concerned with the ums and pauses and stuff. But I think like people really underestimate like when you're listening to a podcast, it's usually kind of an action in the background. So it should reduce like yeah, it should reduce that need to feel like you're talking perfectly, like in perfect prose. So it's very tempting to be super prepared in what you're gonna say, but in reality, you're always adapting to what they're saying. I think like my first five or so podcasts, it was all kind of pre-planned out. I didn't drift from the questioning line at all. But I think that's what made it worse.
Sure, but so would you say there's a sweet spot of like knowing who the person is and having the context to sort of spar with them versus having this really pre-canned list of questions?
Yeah, I just definitely say like people enjoy kind of like I would say the guests coming on, depending on who they are, th- like if they've gone on a couple podcasts already, they'd probably really really prefer like questions that were kind of off the wall, questions that aren't what they usually rehearse, just because it's a fresh take on certain things. I think after the conversation I had with David Perel, like in the middle of it, we kind of got sidetracked, and basically there was a point where I was kind of like saying, "This is a bit off topic, but let's talk about this." And we just randomly talked about like content creator houses for like maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And after the podcast, he said he basically we talked a bit afterwards, but he's like, that's the point where I knew like we were going to have something really interesting to say. And like this helped me come up with an idea I wanted to talk about on my newsletter. And that's when I know it's a valuable conversation or it's a valuable
Mm,
podcast. Like, and that kind of like reframed my idea, right? Like my goal of the podcast is not just to like extract like from this person, like all this information, but it's also like a little bit to help them come up with cool new ideas as well. Like, so you're going to kind of have to look at like, these are the general areas they're interested in. What could that like piece together to be like the next thing that they would want to talk about?
that's cool. And this is, I think, along the same lines of that idea, but the notion of avoiding the hey, tell me about yourself, and then asking the the very staple like bog standard interview questions. The podcast circuit is so inundated with the same conversation, just a different person asking the questions.
Yeah. I think like even if you obviously do have to ask some basic questions to set up, but I think like even like the podcast I did with you, like just trying to put a little spin on like the intro questions to make them more entertaining. I think the first question I asked you was like if someone bumped into you on the street, like how would you describe what you do? Or like just something like that is so much more interesting than like please describe who you are, who you
Yeah,
are.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like questions like that are hard to answer too because you just feel like you're rambling on for, 18 minutes. It's like, where do I start? Like when I was 5 years old, last week, I'm not sure. And like, yeah, it's more uncomfortable than, feeling like you're having a conversation with a friend, which I think leads to our next point.
Yeah, so I think like it's kind of all led down to this like that conclusion that your research does really matter. Like even if it doesn't make it into like the final kind of like a couple questions that you have that you really want to ask, like just reading a bunch of their stuff, looking at their last couple tweets. I really like watching a video if they have like a if they've done a podcast with someone else or if they've done a YouTube video with someone else. I think that's really telling for me. I feel like once I hear someone speak, once I hear see someone like uh, act on video on recording, it kind of helps me read them a lot in terms of like what would they respond well. I'm very much kind of like to analyze my person, my guests beforehand to
Yeah.
to to be able to I guess like see if I can like connect with them on that level.
Yeah, and I think you've done a great job of that from the interviews that I've watched. And I remember, I mean, that was a long time ago now, 4 or 5 months ago we spoke, but it was a refreshing break in the sort of programmatic feeling, you know, run of the mill podcast line of questioning. So credit to you for that. And obviously, anyone watching this should go and check out Brandon's podcast to see how this translates into application. What how are you thinking about evolving it? I know you've sort of thought about it in seasons so far. Is there a reason why you're you have this like season approach? How what's next?
Yeah, I think like originally when I wanted to launch season two, it just felt like it was the right moment because I had a bunch of people that agreed to come on, and I thought it'd be cool to kind of just like have that as a focus. I think going forward, actually, like it's kind of like I thought season two was going to be this moment where I was like I really knew kind of like who I wanted to talk to, but really, I always say like people the podcasts I look up to. Probably like in terms of like the conversation on there and the type of the interview styles, like someone like a Joe Rogan. I mean, I don't agree with all of the man's like political views and world views, but I think he's a lot of people attack him for not being the best host and being carried by the guests each time, but I think he's a really good host. And I think like what I enjoy is that he brings on people like really from all different kinds of walks of life and kind of like during this season
Did we lose him?
I think his thing froze.
He's been frozen and talking for the last 30 seconds, but now I think he just dropped out. All right. If anyone's got questions for him, yeah, the dorm Wi-Fi is a good shout, Jonathan. if anyone's got questions for Brandon, hopefully he'll reconnect and we can ask him when he gets back. We got another half an hour, but I'm sure he'll jump back in. Yeah, he's gone. He's gone.
I think I'm back now. Sorry.
Oh, there he is. All right,
Yeah,
good
yeah,
stuff. I was expecting at least a 5 minute filler there, so it's a good job.
Which part did I cut out from, I guess?
You were talking about the Joe Rogan as the guest carrying, being accused of the guest carrying the conversation, but that style being interesting or something that you aspire to emulate in some way.
Yeah, I just feel like it's always like connecting. He has a core set of things that he brings it back to, but he really does go into depth on each person that he researches. I think that's one thing I like, and it's really the off the wall questions as well. Like I think I listened to a podcast he did with Brian Greene, which is like a professor at Columbia that's actually teaching me this year. So like that's like why I listened to that episode. I was like, that'd be interesting. Like this astrophysicist talking with Joe Rogan about things like obviously he'll bring up aliens and things like that. But
Yeah.
it was just so interesting to see like Joe Rogan went in, he read all of the Professor Green's books and things like that, and it was just so interesting to see how he led that conversation. So I felt like for me, like what it's all about is just learning from these different people. It's not about niching down at all. So I fully accepted that for season two going forward. Just having it be really consistent going in.
And just an observation of mine externally, I think this is kind of the result you get when you don't chase after the thing directly. Like a lot of people will start a podcast as a vehicle to win new business, let's say. Like, I want to find a person that's going to approach me and pay me X, so I'm going to start a podcast. And I think, the laws of the universe, which are difficult to explain, rarely reward that strategy. It's more of a, hey, I'm genuinely interested in these people, and I'm going to put the time in to understand them and guide a great conversation. And the byproduct of that is, all of these different things. Can you speak a little bit to what that byproduct has been and whether or not you agree with that thesis? I'm curious.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that, well, one of the byproducts is getting to work with you. I think that's been one thing, but it just shows like how I mean, would not have even found Visualize Value if I didn't start the podcast, let alone like get to reach out to you and do that. But I think it's just like the podcast in general and reaching out has shown like the doors are there to be open, the doors are there to be found. Like I'm like a 19-year-old kid who hasn't like done anything that impressive. So I feel like if it's just like all about knowing how to talk to certain people at the right time, I think that another thing that podcasting has made me realize is like the network effect is really, really exponential. Like it's at the start, it was hard to find guests. But now I think I've gotten to a good pattern of kind of reaching out to each guest afterwards as well and saying like, who else would you recommend to come on the show? And usually I think just because of the fact that they enjoyed the experience of being on the show, they thought that it was kind of like a different, like you said, it's not kind of as run of the mill as other podcasts. Like I get like eight or nine people that they send my way, and I really have to like almost like I get inundated with the pipeline now instead of having before like really having to cold email and do all of that. I just
And when
think
did you?
that
Yeah, sorry. When did that change? Like, it's the caliber of the guests you interview. I imagine has an impact on, how easy it is to get a yes from the next person.
yeah, and it's also kind of like how close the guests are to you, I guess, like personally. I think that I almost approach it now that I think some of my best performing episodes are with people that are not like the biggest name guests like on my show, right? Like if you kind of look at it from just a baseline worldview perspective, like who has come on my show, like James Clear, like that's probably like a lot of people know James Clear. Like my girlfriend's mom knows who James Clear is. So it's like a very recognizable brand.
Yeah.
But he's not my best performing episode. My best performing episode is the one with you and the one with Nat Eliason.
Oh,
And I
cool.
think the reason for that is not because like the quality of the episode or anything like that. It's just because like you and Nat kind of bought into me as a person as well. Like you helped promote the episode. Like Nat put it on his email list. Like he quote retweeted on Twitter. Like just talked about it more. Whereas like obviously James has a massive Twitter audience, but like most of the distribution was through me and doing that there. And obviously his name brand will draw a ton of people to come, but it's still like trying to find people. I think it's like there's a ladder theory to it. Like you're trying to find people that are two or three rungs ahead of you that kind of will resonate with what you're doing, be impressed by you by virtue of the conversation, and want to help you. Like people that will go out of their ways to promote you to their friends, the
Mm,
ones that will go out of their way to put you on their email list, put you on their other distribution channels just because they enjoyed the conversation they had with you. I think like that's how you capitalize on success instead of shooting like a ton of moonshots at people uh, like a Derek Sivers or tons of best-selling authors and things like that.
yeah, I would 100% echo that. I think there has been, maybe three or four instances where I've gone on a podcast and afterwards just been like, oh, I'm looking forward to that thing being released because the conversation was so interesting. And I think if you're able to like lock into that like mutually beneficial asset as a result of the conversation, that again, going back to the law of reciprocity, just aim to aim to give someone a great experience and produce something that maybe even surprises them, right? The conversation that you have is like almost helps them think about how they present what they do in a different way. You challenge their ideas. I think there's that's kind of a different frame than, oh, if I only just get this person with a big audience on my podcast, then I'm going to be set, right? I'll never have to promote my stuff again. I think that's that's an illusion, honestly, and it's reassuring and interesting to hear that that is like proven out in practice here.
Yeah, I think like on the idea of reciprocity, I will say one thing. I think it's more applicable just in general, like not just for people who are thinking about podcasting, but I think like just for any call in general, like it is really determined by the first 5 minutes and kind of the last 5 minutes. So for me, that's kind of like when I'm onboarding the guest and when I'm like leaving and concluding the conversation. Like these are the parts where it's not seen on the podcast, but it really makes or breaks the conversation. The first 5 minutes, it really determines like how well you know someone, like like getting off on the front foot, like being able to vibe with them in terms
Mm-hmm.
of just like knowing what you want to talk about, being on the same page of like I guess like if one of them they might want to like subtly promote like a product or something, just like really connecting there. And I really love this analogy. It might be a little crude, but I think Eric Torenberg talks about it. He like did a tweet thread where he was like the 5 minutes after doing a podcast is kind of like the 5 minutes like after you have sex. It's kind of like, oh, how did you feel? Like how was
Uh,
that? Like
uh,
it's like very much like you're trying to wrap things up and you're trying to package it in a way where both of you come away with something and
right.
getting on the stage about like what you're getting at. I think that's really important. Like having a clear call to action and being able to create a lasting impression to stay in touch, right? Um, Finding common ground as well is super important for continuing the conversation afterwards. I think people are always asking like, how do you like because I think the biggest thing about the podcast is it's not just I have this guest on and I never talk to them again. Like I went to you to talk about Visualize Valley, like potentially working for you.
Mm-hmm.
Nat and I discovered we went to the same high school, became close friends afterwards, and I've talked with him about like how he runs his Rome course, like what his future plans are. We might do a collab for his YouTube video, for his YouTube about like how to use Rome research to take notes, just really trying to follow up with someone. Obviously, don't do it with everyone. I try and judge it based on like I said, the first and last 5 minutes, like really determine like, is this someone I can be future associates and friends with, someone I would be willing to connect with in the future, someone who's going to be a future mentor. I think that that's just a point I really want to get across. It's super important for anyone not just like podcasting, but looking to connect and communicate with someone.
That's great. That's great advice. There's a couple of questions we have here. Maybe this will lead us down another path too. But George asks what your hit rate was early on when you're reaching out. So was there 1 out of 10 people responding to you, 1 out of 50 people? How difficult was it to get started?
Yeah, I think like because I went with the ladder theory, I didn't shoot for the moon right at the start. I think my hit rate was actually really was good at the start, was really good. I think like with Jack, with Ann Lore, with those people, I think it was kind of like when I was making that transition out of just reaching out to college students, it was around like 70, 80%, I would say, because maybe I was aiming too low. Maybe I was like kind of being too conservative. I'm not sure looking back, but my hit rate was good. I think I had the cold DM tactics down by then. I think that I was also lucky that by virtue of doing those first 5 episodes with college students, like building up that confidence, like I had something to show that I've already produced it. Obviously the first couple of guests are the hardest when you have nothing to show, but like because I reached out to other kids, like they were like, "Oh, you want me to come on a podcast? I'll do that." So that helped a lot just to get the ball rolling.
That's great, man. And the we talked a little bit about this, but in terms of distribution, Carlos is asking like tactically what you've seen to be the best distribution tactic. It would be great if you could reiterate. I think the notion of getting the most out of the guests distribution channels too.
Yeah, I think like the distribution is for me at least it's driven by the guest just because it's an interview style show. For other podcasts you might have to tap into things like Reddit, like indie hackers, like other channels like that, but for me it starts from picking out the guest. So picking out someone like Nat, who's someone who has an email list, who has a Twitter audience, but not just that, like who I feel like I can engage with. I've been like watching his content for a while. Like someone I know I can build a lasting relationship with is usually the best distribution channel, if that makes sense. It's a little unconventional. It's a lot more about selecting people and connecting with them rather than setting up a landing page or things like that. But that's just what's worked for me. And basically using him to reach out to my next couple of guests and finding that has been my go-to.
I think that's powerful. That's a powerful point. The endorsement of somebody that's been interviewed by you is incredibly. That's like a massive force multiplier on the quality of people and the friction in someone accepting your invite. That's an interesting one. I think a lot of people may overlook that. You know, making a warm intro to somebody who maybe even where it's like, hey, I know you're friendly with this person. Do you think they'd be up for a conversation? I think that's kind of it's a little bit of a undiscovered way to grow your network and get access to new people, along with the thing we talked about really early on, which I don't want to gloss over, which is like do that work that allows you to get in front of people that otherwise you would really struggle to get in front of.
Yeah, definitely. It's also just a level of like comfort and adjusting to that. I think like finding like who you're comfortable speaking with, because in the end, that's what matters. So kind of like going back to that childhood friends thing, like the guests you should first reach out to are like who are you watching daily? Who's on your Twitter feed? Like who do you feel like you know?
That's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. We have a couple other questions. Have you ever considered doing solo episodes, reflecting on your recent episodes? That ever crossed your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm always a little cautious of doing that yet, just because I think that the structure I would want to do it as is like a form of a Q&A, kind of like this, not necessarily through Zoom, but I know I'm just like asking that I'm doing a Q&A episode on Twitter, maybe getting a lot of questions there. I think that would be really fun. I think like also initially I was kind of nervous just because I'm really comfortable interviewing someone, but I still needed to get some practice talking on my own. So, but I think recently I've gone on a couple of podcasts myself by virtue of people reaching out on Twitter, and that has helped me build up a lot of confidence as kind of like a guest almost. So I think there's definitely room for solo episodes in the future.
I have a question as well. The behavior, like the consumption behavior of podcasts, always kind of fascinates me. Like, I'm not a huge listener of podcasts. There's like a few that I'll listen to. Like, if I remember, I'm in the car or something, or on a long drive. It's not like my primary source of consumption, so I don't have that much empathy for how people think about podcasts. But I feel as though if you're a host and you can kind of build up a rapport with your audience member based on how you interview, they're way more likely to come back to you and trust your selection of guests rather than go and seek out guests, because it's so easy to find, anybody being interviewed in a podcast. It really does pay dividends to like find a like lean into your style of questioning and rely on that to bring people back to the podcast regardless of who it is you're interviewing.
Yeah, I definitely would agree to that. I think like it's one of those things where your personal brand is like kind of connected to it's very intangible almost, I feel like, for the podcast. And yeah, for me, even like becoming a host myself has decreased my consumption almost. But I do resonate with the fact that when you're first starting out, the podcast audience is really disconnected from you. It's not like a YouTube or a TikTok or Twitter where the comment section is really easily accessible. I think
Yeah.
that now it's like getting a bunch of downloads on an episode. I'll only get feedback from like two or three people, and that's usually through Twitter or through my email list. But I think that one thing I want to get better at in the future is like trying to tap into that because, like you said, like community is really like the biggest part of podcasting. It's the biggest part of like any audience, right? Like you want to be open to people that look up to you and like you. And as of now, like podcast, it's super difficult to do that for podcasting. So trying to tap into that at some point in the future would be awesome. I'm lucky that it's kind of like aligned with my Twitter audience, so a lot of people reach out to me there and give me feedback there. But yeah, that's something I think is super important.
Awesome, man. On the subject of Twitter, Charlie asks, you said you only had 300 followers when you started the podcast. How much of the growth on Twitter do you attribute to the podcast versus independent of, if you have a thought around that?
Yeah, this is tricky because I would say like specifically based off of like when I tweet about like a podcast episode releasing or like if I'm saying I'm interviewing a guest, like the growth, it might be around like 30-40% of my audience, which is still a lot. It's probably like 2,000-3,000 followers is from like being supported by other accounts and things like that.
That's cool.
But really, I think it is a driver of like the entire account as well because like I wouldn't be where I'm at here, just in terms of like the ideas I was exposed to, the people I'm exposed to, and like really realizing like you can do a lot with Twitter, like if I didn't have the podcast. So it's kind of like a inconclusive answer, but I would say I would really attribute all of it to the podcast, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think they're very complementary mediums for sure. And even the process of running a podcast, meeting people, having new conversations is driving like the production process and all your different mediums and making you think about different ideas. And I just think they're like, it's kind of a cool little combo, the Twitter feed and the longer form podcast conversation where you can get a good sense of how somebody thinks and the type of people they surround themselves with and all of those good things. So makes a ton of sense. And he has a follow-up question. Do you have a favorite resource for growing an audience on either or both?
I think I reached out to Chris Williamson, who hosts Modern Wisdom. I think he did a podcast where he talks about his journey. So specifically for podcasting, that'd be what I go to. For Twitter, I don't necessarily have one like fundamental thing. I picked up a lot as I've kind of jumped around, but I'd say Matthew Kobach's presentation with David Perel is really good. He talks about uh, kind of like that was kind of like when I thought I needed to niche down when I watched that webinar. So I don't fully agree with everything in it, but there's a ton of value in that one as well. So I would recommend those two.
All right. And Rodrigo asks, who's been the toughest guest to prep for, and how'd you go about it?
Yeah, I think the toughest guest was actually Ruben Harris. He's the founder of Career Karma, which is like a YC company. I think that was the hardest just because he's a CEO, he's a founder. It was a bit of a different spin on kind of guests that I've done before, where I was originally talking to a lot of like creators and things, but he's been someone who's just like always like who I think he followed me when I had like around 1,000 followers, but he was just super down to earth. So I definitely like overthought that one a lot.
That's good, man. Any like the methodology for seeking out guests, and like do you have a list of people you're approaching? Is that changing all the time? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think I tweeted about this a while ago, but I actually had I had like a small list. I wrote down like 8 people I like really wanted to start when it was that, like I said, that transitionary phase where I was like, I don't want to talk with students anymore. Like I want to talk with some of these people I've been seeing on on Twitter, and I was like, um, these are the 8 people I want to talk to, and I think I've talked to 4 or 5 of them already. I think like um, James was on my list. I think Polina was on my list, but it was just like I have like that kind of list where I was like that was like the original plan of like the way I was going down. But now it's like I said, it's a combination of every month. I think I write a bunch of names down, and then I try and look and see who I might be able to get me to warm intro to who look through. Like I said, sometimes when I get like I just did an episode with Anna Gott. She founded Inner Intellect, and I was like, who are some people um, that you think are really interesting, like female founders, because that's like her network. And she gave me like 8 or 9.
That's
So like just
badass.
like yeah, that adds to the list a lot. Like it's just grown to such a point where it's like having a list of someone at the start of every month, but also just having like a general goal list, and that's I think gonna change soon as I uh, talk with more and more people.
What has like what's the most unexpected result of walking down this path, do you think?
I think one is working with you on digitalized value. I think that's definitely like something that I didn't expect going in to like get a job out of it or get an opportunity out of it. But I think something else has just been like it's shown me that a lot of not to call like people that normally I think like wouldn't have when I started this journey, I didn't think people like would have necessarily resonated with a 19-year-old saying things on certain topics.
Hmm.
But and generally, I think that a lot of a lot of influencers that my friends or people my age look up to, like their audience is generally younger than them. Whereas I think like from my statistics, like most of my audience is older than me,
Right,
which
right.
is surprising to me.
Yeah, that's
But
cool.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I even introduced this conversation as you're 19 years old, and that may, in some cases, be viewed as like, you have a disadvantage, but there's also like it's a super admirable thing to be pursuing at 19 years old. It certainly wasn't what I was doing when I was 19 years old. So there's that's definitely that's definitely something I think you should be proud of as well. That you've put all of this together at that juncture of life when a lot of us were wasting time massively. Yeah. So Connor asked a question about the Brandon Zhang brand. I know you write a newsletter. Is you have any thoughts on kind of where you started there and which medium was the most influential? You still write regularly as well as this, correct?
yeah. So I think like the topic of medium is interesting. Um, I wrote on Medium for a little bit. I wouldn't recommend like starting a blog on Medium. I think they have a feature where you can cross post on there, but really like the important thing is like having things that you own. Like even like Twitter, like you don't necessarily own that. Like that's an open platform. Like you're seeing right now with like the election and everything's going on. Like there's you can see the power. Like the company has power to censor certain things. Like they have the power to change the algorithm that might hugely affect your business or your content. So I would say like focusing on own platforms is really important. So um, I think that also talks about Substack. Like you don't own that platform, you don't own that SEO. Um, Substack is a bit different because you do own the email list you accumulate. You can export it whenever, but like having a podcast, having your own website, you're on your own domain, having your own email list is kind of like what I've always been focusing for. Like Twitter, uh, like things like YouTube are great for growth, but like you don't want to be at the mercy of anything. Like who knows what will happen in the world right now? So it's pretty
Indeed.
crazy.
Indeed. And we have, I was going to call this comment out, Ruben's roommate and brother watching this office hours. It's a small world.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And one other thing we wanted to cover was the gear question. I know, getting tactical here. I'm just going to put this on so it's up on the screen share. If anyone wants to look up that hardware, obviously grab that. But the episodes sound great, so you got that stuff dialed in.
Yeah, I think I would say, trying kind of going back, like talking a bit about like what some of the things that I think Visualized Value taught me about like doing the podcast. One is obviously permissionless apprentice. Like if you really want a guest, like go out there and show why they should like go to you and do that by creating. But I think another thing is the publishing mindset and also the idea of like selling your sawdust. I think like we talked about it earlier, like on Twitter even like people are interested in hearing like your process and your journey. So just sharing like lessons learned, sharing um, what's worked and what hasn't. People did really enjoy that on Twitter, I feel like.
Agreed. On that subject, one asked, you mentioned David Perel saying he had ideas thanks to the episode. Do you do an exercise after you've recorded to extract ideas from your episodes? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think some people are like curious about the process, like going through and like actually like getting the episode like done. Um, so I think that one key thing that some people like sleep on is Otter. It's this app which basically allows like voice to text transcription, and I use it for the podcast, but also just like if I'm thinking about something, like if I'm stuck on something and I need to like talk through it, I'll just talk to myself on
Mm,
Otter and it'll like give a transcription back. But I use it for the podcast to transcribe these like massive like 50-minute long episodes just because like I don't have the time to to do that necessarily.
sure.
But it's really accurate, and from that I do post the entire transcript, but I try and extract like five key takeaways from each episode. And that's a great exercise for me because I'll kind of skim the entire thing. And the five key takeaways are generally like things that I think people will find useful, things that I often find myself applying, like Pomp's episode, like talking about focusing on one platform at a time. Like that's something I've really taken to heart, like just doubling down on just Twitter, and not like dividing my attention too much. And it's just like, yeah, just the five key takeaways has helped me a lot. I used to do kind of show notes, but then I realized like having five actionable things is a lot more useful than just having like a bunch of quotes. And I'll just post the transcript at the bottom in case anyone wants to read that. But yeah.
Yeah, there's something interesting about it. I think you alluded to it earlier that when you post about the episode or even clips from the episode, they generally perform way worse than your native Twitter content. I've seen that with anything that I've done or been on, and it's just super interesting to me that the like this medium has like a life of its own. You know, people bookmark your podcasts in Spotify or iTunes or wherever it pops up, or they consume it on YouTube, and to not be discouraged by the engagement with a podcast on Twitter, like even like a Pomp, right, who's probably in the millions of downloads a month. When he posts about his new episode, it's like 10 people like this thing of an audience of 400,000 people, but that that thing is getting like listened to in you know thousands of places as soon as it gets uploaded. So it's interesting. They definitely play together, but there's not necessarily the same appetite for the content of the podcast on Twitter. I just wanted to call that out, and maybe you can validate that, because I don't want people to get discouraged by the fact that that doesn't get immediate traction on a different platform.
Yeah, I think I posted about it earlier. Like this, I like the past 2 months, I've been sitting around like similar download numbers and things like that. And this month, there's kind of like a breakthrough. And I think that was just like part of me understanding that like Twitter's a great driver for your audience and everything. But like you said, with the algorithm and everything, it does try and minimize like how often you leave the platform. That's why like links perform so badly. So
Makes sense.
like any a link usually doesn't perform as great. So I would say like Twitter's a great like growth platform, but really try and like incorporating ways of like promoting your stuff other than kind of being like new announcement, like here's my podcast. Obviously I do that every week because people have grown into a pattern to expect it now, but it's not, I don't think it's honestly the main driver. I think more of it is just like sending out other tweets and like building an audience there, and people coming and seeing like, oh, this guy's a podcast, like that's pretty interesting. Honestly think that's a bigger driver of growth. I think another thing is like, right, like posting like just getting into a habit of posting so many different times, because not everyone sees your announcement tweet, like maybe doing one about like asking questions for the guests, like doing one about like summarizing conversation, and just playing around with it and experimenting with it, is because Twitter is really just a tricky platform that um, does a lot of things that are very interesting.
Yeah, I was just going to say the chances are that you're going to launch your tweet when somebody has a spare hour to listen to your thing. The chances
Yeah,
of those two things overlapping are just slim to none, right? It's more of a medium that you seek out when you're in that, whether it's you drive or when you're cleaning your house, whatever the habit is that you have. It's not like you're going to be able to interrupt someone's day and get them to listen to an hour of your podcast. All right, I think we're in good shape here, on time as well. Brandon, this has been superb. If you're not following Brandon on Twitter, let me fire up a new slide here and make sure he's also
no,
in the community, obviously, if you want to get hold of him. This is correct, right, Brandon?
yeah, that looks great.
All right, so give the man a follow, and follow up questions. He's in the community and he's all over Twitter. So, mate, thank you
Yeah.
for your time. A pleasure, and we'll see you.
Thanks everyone.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a nice night, morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Cheers. Bye bye.